Now an Open University programme for the Arts Foundation course. Colin Cunningham traces the history of the Victoria and Albert Museum in the 19th century, from its pioneering origins as part of Prince Albert's grand educational design to its establishment in the 1890s as a treasure house of great works.
We tend to take our great museums for granted. The imposing, almost daunting grandeur of their architecture seems entirely appropriate for long-established treasure houses of art and knowledge. Yet, many of those collections, and the museums that house them, date only from the last century. To the Victorians, they were a new development in education, providing collections available to all, or at least to all who had the leisure to visit the museums. The South Kensington Museum didn't acquire its present name, or these grand buildings, until the turn of the century. The effect of all this is to suggest a sense of tradition and permanence, and of absolute objective values for the contents. Appropriately, the spire is capped by a statue of Fame. Yet, behind the uniformity of the facade, you can look down on the buildings inside and see from the jumble of roofs just how piecemeal the museum's development really was. Working backwards from 1909, when the main facade was completed, we can see that before then there was no grand exterior at all. The library, built between 1878 and 83, replaced a set of temporary museum buildings. The cast courts and science schools were only completed in the early 1870s. And the central block and the north and south courts to the right were built between 1862 and 69. And between 1857 and 59, the Vernon, Turner and Sheepshanks galleries. Before that, there was just a temporary museum of corrugated iron painted green and white. And in 1851, only Brompton Park House, at the centre of a large estate, for sale. So why was the building so piecemeal? And what can that reveal about the reasons for setting up the museum in the first place? 1851, of course, was the year of the Great Exhibition in Hyde Park, where these cast iron gates were a star exhibit. The exhibition was a huge and profitable success. Yet there was criticism of what was seen as the generally poor standard of design in British manufactured goods, especially when compared to the French. Immediately after the exhibition, £5,000 was made available for the purchase of examples of the best design from among the exhibits, such as this Sèvres porcelain vase. Prince Albert hoped to use these items to establish an institution that would serve to increase the means of industrial education and extend the influence of science and art upon productive industry. The purchases displayed a wide range of tastes, including this elaborate metal flagon, a British exhibition piece. Among those who selected the items were Henry Cole, who'd helped to mastermind the Great Exhibition, and Pugin, the Gothic revival architect. It's hardly surprising to find items he designed for the exhibition included in the collection. The collection was first displayed in the Government School of Design in rooms at Marlborough House. But the Embryo Museum soon outgrew this space, and in 1855 was transferred to Brompton Park House and renamed the Department of Science and Art. in keeping with the Prince's original ambition. With the Prince's support and £15,000 from Parliament, a sort of cut-price Crystal Palace was added. A temporary iron structure covered in corrugated sheeting instead of glass. It housed a variety of collections, including an educational museum, a trade museum, mineral collections, the Kew Museum of Vegetable Produce, and the Museum of Patents. The journal The Builder nicknamed it the Brompton Boilers and pointed out its ugliness is unmitigated. Privately, Cole, who was now in charge, agreed, but he needed to find some form of leverage to press for a more permanent building. The first major boost came with a collection of pictures presented by John Sheepshanks. These were mostly by contemporary artists and gave the museum the basis of a collection of modern British art. Several of these paintings are from the Sheepshanks bequest, including this one, The Governess, painted by Richard Redgrave. John Sheepshanks wanted his paintings displayed in an open, airy situation, possessing the quiet necessary to the study and enjoyment of works of art, and free from the dirt and inconveniences of the main thoroughfares of the metropolis. By that he meant that he didn't want the pictures to go to the National Gallery, and it was something of a coup for Cole to secure them for South Kensington. But Sheepshanks also stipulated that a decent building should be erected before he gave the pictures, which allowed Cole to press for the building of the first permanent structure on the site to have any pretensions to grandeur. It was designed by Captain Francis Folk of the Royal Engineers, who became a sort of resident architect to the museum. The new gallery was, controversially, lit by gas, allowing the museum to stay open late in an attempt to lure working men from the pubs. The educational ambition was important. This painting, The Martyrdom of St. Ursula, was originally bought not as a work of art, but to provide training in costume design. Yet the aim of instructing designers required a collection of high-quality items from which they could learn. Since 1853, John Charles Robinson, the curator, had been acquiring fine objects like these medieval croziers. The collections grew as works were either donated or bought, and Robinson was largely responsible for the museum's outstanding collection of medieval and Renaissance works. His approach was that of a connoisseur rather than an educator like Cole. Not surprisingly, the two men often disagreed. The ceramic collection reflected Robinson's historical interests. But since Cole wanted it to influence designers, it also reflected contemporary taste. In 1859, the museum acquired this modern ewer by the Staffordshire firm of Mintons, and a year later, this 17th century French original by Bernard Palissy. Clearly, designers were learning from the past, though I wonder if this sort of plagiarism was quite what Prince Albert or Henry Cole intended. However fine the collection, on its out-of-town site, this ramshackle museum was not the popular success it needed to be. So, in 1863, Cole arranged an exhibition of the wedding presents of the Prince and Princess of Wales. In just 17 days, an astonishing 230,000 people visited the museum. This was the inaugural exhibition of the new North Court. That had been built, with the South Court, on the eastern side of the Sheepshanks Gallery. The western facade was rebuilt in the 20th century to match the bright red brick and terracotta of the first grand exterior planned by Captain Folk in 1864, the lecture theatre block. The ceramic mosaic pediment designed by a staff designer and made by the South Kensington mosaic class, commemorates the international coming together of science and art in the Great Exhibition. A reminder of how the museum began, portrayed in a new experimental material. On what was intended as the main entrance doors are reliefs of great scientists on the left and fine artists on the right. The science here is absorbed into fine art portrayal, and the rich decoration of the new block, for all the materials were experimental, is effectively a piece of artistic surface display. It's lavish because by the mid-60s, the museum was becoming conscious of its own history. Commemorated in this mosaic panel are some of the leading personalities behind the building and the design schools. Robinson isn't there, but Redgrave and Cole, the architect Folk, and the designer Sykes are. The men who, between them, were primarily responsible for what became known as the South Kensington style, both outside and in. Sykes and his successor Moody used other experimental processes, like painting onto ceramic tiles, to create this kind of rich decoration. They combined it with glazed and moulded ceramics and Renaissance-style motifs. And they made this staircase a really grand approach to the museum's upper floor. It was completed in 1867 and originally enhanced by a stained glass window. In among all this, once again, are symbolic and literal reminders that this was the Department of Science and Art. Technically, this may have been a triumph of the modern potter's art, but the painted decoration, aping the high Renaissance style, rather lacks the draftsmanship of the fine artworks that inspired it. The iconography endlessly repeats the ambition to combine science and art. But with the museum's growing success, all these demonstrations of art being applied to manufacture were turning the buildings into an exhibit, and the museum was committed to displaying what its authorities considered to be the best and latest taste. 3 new refreshment rooms were the outstanding example. This, the grill room by Edward Poynter, later president of the Royal Academy, was felt by many critics to be the most successful. The grill is the first appearance in Britain of the new Japanese taste. It's a virtuoso piece of craftsmanship, as is the moulded plasterwork. But the chief effect is achieved quite simply by panels of tiles designed by Poynter and painted by the young ladies of the South Kensington art schools. They were paid 6p an hour for work described as a new and interesting occupation for young women. New, that is, for young ladies, since girls had been working in the potteries for generations. This was work for middle-class gentlefolk, not the artisans the optimists of the 1850s might have been hoping to reach. With a fine artist as designer, this room reflects the very latest in taste. These maidens in loose flowing robes belong to the aesthetic movement, a development from the more pre-Raphaelite style in the gilded panels of the room designed by William Morris's company. His work was rooted in a nostalgic version of the Middle Ages. But Morris's firm had only been in existence for 4 years. The award of the contract to such a new firm was both an economy for the museum and a display of modern taste. Morris was concerned that the decoration should take proper account of the technical side of production. The pattern of the plaster on the walls was designed to disguise the repetition of the square panels. All this is in marked contrast to the room next door, designed by James Gamble of the museum's own design team. The floor, walls, windows and ceiling are all covered with moulded and painted patterns. Here is everything we've come to expect from the South Kensington designers, including their usual whimsy. There's a frieze of Renaissance putti, eating and drinking, and appropriate or uplifting texts, like this.
This central room was described as sumptuous, bright and cheerful, but lacking harmony and repose. For me, it epitomizes the South Kensington style of interior decoration. I find it fascinating that in addition to washable enamel ceilings, they've chosen glazed ceramic for the walls and columns. It's a hard-wearing, washable surface that's ideal for public spaces, especially refreshment rooms. And of course, it allowed plenty of scope for the richly moulded decoration that seems to have been so popular with the department. But when we look close, we can see that much of this decoration is far from easy to clean. Art has effectively taken over from function here, and it's stretched craftsmanship to the limits and beyond. Many of the column casings don't fit precisely. Neither do the tiles above.
This sort of decoration may be acceptable in refreshment rooms, but you have to remember that at South Kensington, it was carried through to the galleries as well, competing with the exhibits. Objects such as this 16th century German stove were chosen by Robinson and his staff as outstanding examples of the traditional potter's art. For the South Kensington designers, it was a fruitful source of Renaissance motifs. It was the sort of resource for designers that the museum had been collecting since the 1850s.
This lavish Italian piece was yet another of the items purchased from the Great Exhibition that inspired the South Kensington style. Here, it's on display in the Bethnal Green Museum, which is, in fact, the Brompton Boilers, dismantled in 1867 and re-erected in East London as a satellite museum in an area of working-class housing and small workshops. The aim was the same: to provide intellectual recreation and to foster good design. The building opened with a lone exhibition of pictures from the Wallace collection. There were also the same mixed exhibits of science and art. The art school and library that were promised never materialized. As the Bishop of London rather acidly remarked, this missionary experiment was a lost opportunity.
The failure of the satellite museum at Bethnal Green was partly due to economics, but attention was being focused on other areas of education, and government money was being put into a new natural history museum at Brompton. This affected the development of the headquarters museum itself. Not that difficulties in funding were anything new. Rather, they were the root cause of the piecemeal development so far. Work on this building was actually stopped for a year for lack of funds. Originally designed as a school of naval architecture, it was used as the science schools and didn't become part of the museum itself until 1974. Yet, ironically, it was the first building of the Science and Art Department to have a street facade, and was lavishly decorated in true South Kensington style. But this art decoration really points up the contrast with the building's function. By 1870, the tension between science and art, between school and museum, was becoming critical. The scientific collections were already being transferred to galleries across the road, where the science museums would be built some 50 years later. Meanwhile, the museum concentrated on collecting and displaying examples of the best in decorative art. And there were more and more masterpieces of fine art too, selected to give a representative collection of great works of art. But Donatello's David is a plaster cast, not the original. The presence of reproductions in a museum may seem odd to us, but it emphasises the educational purpose of the South Kensington establishment. Students would learn, it was hoped, by seeing and copying the very best examples of the past. The selection of works, such as Michelangelo's David, was not controversial. But the cast collection was large, and its range reveals a good deal about the aesthetic standards and art historical interests of the time. At first, it was largely of ornamental details, mostly of the French and Italian Renaissance. But by the 1860s, the collection had been widened to include items such as this complete sculptured pulpit from the cathedral at Pisa. It had been reconstructed there from fragments in 1627, and its recognition as an important example of its time probably owes a good deal to Ruskin's championship of such late medieval work. Most of the pieces, collected in the 60s and early 70s, were architectural sculpture. That is, sculpture where it forms part of a larger decorative scheme. And some of these decorative schemes were actually quite sizable. The casts of this 12th century portal from the cathedral at Santiago in Spain originally had to be displayed in several different rooms in the museum. They could only be shown together from 1873, when the museum opened two huge courts, large enough to hold a cast of Trajan's column in two pieces. The collection illustrates almost all the recognized peaks of Western art, and much Oriental material. Yet the emphasis was on the High Renaissance, which popular taste accepted as the high peak of artistic achievement. This is art on the grand scale, displayed to impress. So it's no surprise to find that in the 1860s it was proposed to fill the arched end of the South Court with a reproduction of Raphael's masterpiece, The School of Athens. In the event, it was decided to commission a modern British painter to design two works in keeping with the museum's aims. They chose Frederick Leighton, an artist with an established but rising reputation. This is his sketch for The Industrial Arts Applied to War.
For the second of his frescoes, The Industrial Arts as Applied to Peace, Leighton chose to use allegorical figures in a classical setting. This oil sketch shows us the design of the work, but not its scale. The finished painting really is decoration in the grand manner. By about 1870, the museum was in a position to commission for its decoration something that is effectively high art.
When completed in 1886, the fresco was much praised, and, in keeping with the museum's aims, students were sent to study it as an exceptional example of decoration. Its status as a fine artwork is a measure of the museum's development between 1850 and 1890. Within 20 years, Leighton himself was canonized in the decoration of the new buildings. This was now a treasure house filled with works of established quality. In its first 50 years, the South Kensington Museum had developed from a rather suspect pioneering venture into the great established Victoria and Albert Museum, a landmark in the history of taste.
Next week, Colin Cunningham explores King Cotton's palace when he sees how Manchester's town hall wasn't just built to house the administrators for a growing city, but also as a symbol of civic pride. That's next Monday at the same time.